Which Impressionist painter made a viable living during their lifetime with paintings of fashionable models and beautiful outdoor scenes, while also fulfilling the rigid societal expectations of marriage and motherhood in the 19th century? If you guessed Berthe Morisot, then you are correct. French Impressionist painter Berthe Morisot was born on January 14, 1841 in Bourges, France, to father Edmé Thibausse Morisot and mother Marie-Josephine Corneille-Thomas. She was the third of 4 children, which included 2 older sisters and 1 younger brother. The family were bourgeois, or upper middle class, which meant Morisot and her siblings were provided with an excellent education. This education included artistic training, which both Morisot and her sister Edma excelled at. When Morisot was 11 in 1852, her parents moved the family to Paris, where she would live for the rest of her life. Although an artistic education was expected for girls in their economic class, art schools at the time only accepted male students, so Morisot and her sister Edma learned art through private tutors. They studied with artist Joseph Guichard, who supervised their visits to the Louvre, where part of their study included making master copies. Both sisters showed incredible artistic promise, enough that Guichard wrote in a letter to their father, "Considering the character of your daughters, my teaching will not endow them with minor drawing-room accomplishments. They will become painters." He went on to warn, "In the world of the grande bourgeoisie in which you move, this will be revolutionary, I would even say catastrophic." Art was not an easy vocation for men to pursue during this time. Any challenges a man might face in pursuing a career in the arts would likely be insurmountable for a woman and, in Guichard's opinion, disastrous for both daughters and parents. The scandal he anticipated could very likely ruin the family. Thibausse was clearly of a differing opinion, as he continued the artistic education of his daughters. When the Morisot sisters grew tired of studying the old masters, they went on to study with the Barbizon painter Jean-Baptiste Camille Corot. Barbizon was a school of painting that was active in France between roughly 1830 and 1870. Most works in the Barbizon style were landscape paintings with a focus on realism, although the category also covers paintings including farm workers and genre scenes of village life. The style emphasizes loose brushwork and softness of form. Corot introduced the sisters to painting en plein air. It was difficult for women to paint outdoors in 19th century France because at the time, society dictated a respectable single woman must not appear in public without a chaperone. In an 1875 letter to her sister Edma, Morisot complained about the difficulties of painting outdoors. "Everything sways. There is an infernal lapping of water. One has the sun and the wind to cope with. The boats change position every minute. The moment I set up an easel, more than 50 boys and girls are swarming about me, shouting and gesticulating. All this ended in a pitched battle, and the owner of the field came to tell me rudely that I should have asked permission to work there." Despite the necessity for a chaperone, as well as the difficulties laid out in her letter, Morisot took as many opportunities as she could to paint outdoors throughout her life. Berthe Morisot was probably her own harshest critic. In her youth, if she was unhappy with the results of a painting or drawing, she destroyed it. As an amateur artist myself, I'm disappointed that her student efforts no longer exist, but I also absolutely understand why she did it. Eventually, though, she was making art that she was confident enough to share. Morisot had 2 landscape paintings accepted into the Paris Salon of 1864 when she was 23. Her sister Edma's work also made it into the Salon that year, and the two would both have their work accepted in each of the subsequent years through 1868. Morisot met Edouard Manet in 1868 while painting at the Louvre. Much like with Mary Cassatt and Degas, there is a lot of speculation about the nature of Morisot's relationship with Edouard Manet. Although married, Manet was considered a playboy of his time and was known to frequent brothels and engage in extramarital affairs. Whether he had such an affair with Morisot is unknown, and I don't have any particular interest in speculating one way or the other. I will say that she was apparently his favorite model, as he painted her a total of 12 times. He never painted her again after her 1874 marriage to his younger brother Eugene. That isn't to say that the two stopped associating after her marriage, as they continued to work together in a friendly and professional capacity until his death in 1883. Morisot encouraged Manet to try painting en plein air, which had a huge impact on his works going forward. Although Morisot always appeared to regard Manet as her artistic and intellectual equal, that regard may not have been fully reciprocated. Her 1869 work titled Reading, which features her mother, Marie Josephine, and her sister, Edma, was accepted to the 1870 Paris Salon. Prior to its submission, it seems Manet took it upon himself to make alterations to Marie Josephine's dress, an action which I think rightfully angered Morisot. It's unthinkable that he would do such a thing to a male colleague. That he did it to Morisot suggests he didn't view their relationship as equal. Edma Morisot's promising artistic career effectively ended in 1869 with her marriage. Some of my research suggests that between the two sisters, Edma was even more skilled than Morisot. Although she moved away from Paris with her husband, Edma kept up regular correspondence with her sister and supported and encouraged her artistic career for the rest of her life. Manet introduced Morisot to the rest of the painters who would become the Impressionists, which included the likes of Renoir, Monet, and Pissarro. Although he considered the men in the group to be colleagues, Manet was more comfortable in his traditional artistic career and discouraged Morisot from associating too much with the Impressionists. Morisot did not listen, and her work was included in the first Impressionist exhibition of 1874 when she was 33 years old. This was one of the works she exhibited that year. Her 1872 painting titled The Cradle, featuring her sister Edma with baby daughter Blanche. The eye-catching feature of this piece is, of course, the titular cradle, which takes up nearly 3/4 of the painting. The cradle is so large it continues past the edges of the canvas, pulling the viewer into the very intimate and private scene. A delicate, flimsy canopy of gauzy lace covers the sleeping baby, partially obscuring her from view. In contrast, Edma's features are clearly defined. I've read some very different interpretations of this painting. Some people see a young mother gazing lovingly at her new child, filled with quiet content as she contemplates her sleeping daughter's face. Others see something a little more bleak. Edma looks tired and lonely. She stands out in sharp isolation against gauzy softness. Her world, which was once very large and included room for her joy and artistic pursuit, has shrunk down and enclosed her in the rigid, pastel box of motherhood. I get the feeling that different people view this painting differently based on their own feelings surrounding motherhood. Philosophical musings aside, this painting also displays the sort of technical execution the Impressionist painters were interested in pursuing. How to effectively depict the color white in pigment was an ongoing quest for the Impressionists. Morisot has delivered an effective solution in this painting. When she was 33 in 1874, Morisot married Edouard Manet's younger brother Eugene. The union was an extremely lucky match for Morisot. Eugene was also an artist, but in an unusual move, he put his own career on the back burner in order to manage and support his wife's. Morisot continued to exhibit her works under her maiden name, and she and Eugene had a very agreeable marriage. In 1875, a public sale was organized in the Hôtel Drouot of Paris. Works by most of the Impressionists were up for auction, including 12 pieces by Morisot. When the first of her works was shown at the auction, a man in the audience yelled, "Horror!" Retaliation was swift and brutal and came in the form of Camille Pissarro, who stood up and punched the man. I imagine the scene descended into chaos as the auction was only able to continue after the police were called in. At the end of the auction, Morisot's interior sold for the highest price of 480 francs, compared to a piece by Renoir that only sold for 180. Out of all of the Impressionists, it seemed Morisot may have been the most financially stable. Critics of the Impressionist artists often seem to have kinder words for Morisot's works than for those of her colleagues, and her paintings routinely sold for high prices throughout her lifetime. Part of the reason for her success is attributed to her eye for fashion and domestic trends of the time. She also, having direct experience with the highly uncomfortable female fashion of her time, often depicted her models' clothing imperfectly, with buttons and ribbons astray, rather than picture-perfect as her male colleagues might have done. Morisot gave birth to her only child, daughter Julie, in November 1878 when she was 37. Julie was one of Morisot's favorite models, as she painted her daughter many times throughout her childhood. My favorite of Morisot's paintings of her daughter also include her husband Eugene. Women with their children have always been a common subject in Western art across the centuries, but it's much rarer to see depictions of fathers with their children. Morisot missed only one Impressionist exhibition of the 8 total put together by the group, the exhibition held in April in 1879. The reason she gave was that she was still recovering from the birth of her daughter 5 months prior, but I have seen it suggested she may also have avoided it for another reason. 1879 was the first year the American painter Mary Cassatt exhibited with the Impressionists. It's thought Morisot used the recent birth of her daughter to sit the exhibit out in order to avoid the inevitable comparison critics would draw between herself and Cassatt, the two female aberrations in that particularly highly criticized boys' club. My research is mostly made up of easily accessible articles from online sources, so I want to talk briefly about something that bothered me as I looked into Morisot. Wikipedia is my starting place for standard general information when I begin a new research project, so that's what I'll be talking about here. Berthe Morisot's article mentions Cassatt by name twice, and both times in passing. Likewise, Cassatt's article mentions Morisot by name twice, and while it states that they were friends and colleagues, that is literally all the attention their relationship received on Wikipedia. These women were both members of the Impressionist circle and obviously knew one another, but all of my wiki and non-Wikipedia sources universally chose to focus on their relationships with their male colleagues, Cassatt with Degas and Morisot with Manet. Morisot was such a non-entity in Cassatt's article and in all the other reading I did about Cassatt that I didn't realize how deeply involved she was in the Impressionist circle until I started actually reading about her. When I went deliberately searching for sources that described the interactions between Morisot and Cassatt, I came up pretty lacking. Cassatt only receives passing mention in Morisot's correspondence, and most of those mentions come from her correspondent than from Morisot herself. Maybe the two didn't actually interact much, which seems strange, but not impossible. I would have liked to have explored the relationship, but since I couldn't find any records regarding it, I figured I'd at least mention why I didn't talk about it. Morisot painted this self-portrait in 1885 when she was 44 years old. It's oil on canvas and 50 by 61 centimeters, or 19.7 by 24 inches. That's a little over 1.5 feet by 2 feet. So, while it's rather small compared to some of the other self-portraits I've studied, it's about 2 times larger than the self-portrait Mary Cassatt painted in 1880 with a similar composition. One of the things I really like about this portrait is Morisot has pushed her Impressionist style so far she's almost moved to abstraction. The palette in the lower left of the piece is made up of only a few sweeping brush strokes which merely suggested the object ostensibly held in her hand. Morisot didn't typically draw on her canvas before painting. She was constantly making sketches and studies so that when she sat down to paint, she could pick up her brush and just begin. This portrait really exhibits the messy sort of incomplete look some critics complained about in regards to her work. Morisot believed that painting should strive to capture something that passes. I really feel like the loose, squiggly brush strokes she's used in the background suggest this sort of snapshot she was looking to create. The broad gestures behind her, as well as the unpainted canvas peeking in around the edges, create a lovely vignette, and to give a sort of ephemeral quality to the whole piece. Eugene Manet suffered from poor health for several years leading up to his death in 1892. Morisot was beside herself with grief, but based on her letters at the time, she pulled herself together both for her own dignity and for Julie's sake. Morisot's daughter Julie contracted pneumonia in 1895. While caring for her, Morisot also became ill, and she unfortunately passed away on March 2, 1895, at the age of 54. In 1890, Morisot wrote, "I don't think there has ever been a man who treated a woman as an equal, and that's all I would have asked for I know I'm worth as much as they." Berthe Morisot's occupation is listed as none on her death certificate. Despite her enormous body of work and the undeniable success of her career, the powerful prejudice of the time denied her the courtesy of recognizing her incredible achievements because of her gender. Although it seems Morisot never felt as if she were regarded as an equal to men, even by her male colleagues, those same colleagues did hold her in high regard. 1 year after her death, her fellow Impressionists Renoir, Degas, and Manet organized an exhibition of her work at a gallery in Paris. Even though Morisot is not a household name today in the same way as Degas or Manet, I do think that's changing. There is a steadily increasing interest in uncovering forgotten women artists and giving them the recognition and credit they're due. So, once again, my biggest struggle with this portrait was in depicting the face, but not for the usual reasons I've had in the past. I think what I finished with is actually a pretty decent likeness, but in the opposite direction of Morisot's loose and painterly version. I spent a lot of time trying to loosen it up, but finally stopped when my efforts were only doing the opposite. I had a difficult time creating visible brush strokes. I kind of wonder if that's because I'm using gouache instead of oil, or maybe I'm just not using enough paint. It's hard to say because I've never painted with oil, so I really don't know how the two compare. I also have to admit that I might be being too precious with my supplies to achieve dimensional paint strokes, which I do think gouache can achieve. Morisot's colors were described as light and delicate throughout my various research sources. While those descriptors can be pretty subjective, I'm pretty sure my colors are way too saturated for anyone to mistake them for Morisot's subtle blends. Her dress might look closer to my digital reference if I'd used yellow ochre as the base instead of lemon yellow, but I don't know, I think the brighter palette suits her. To conclude though, while there are definitely areas for improvement vis-a-vis mimicking the Impressionist style, I'm still happy with how this turned out. It's definitely better than my first Impressionist effort. Thank you for joining me for this little peek into the life of Berthe Morisot. If you enjoyed this video, you can check out the others I've done on my channel. I'm going to be taking a short break from making these so I can focus on other projects. I will absolutely be making more, probably in a few months, because I've still got a lengthy list of incredible artists I'm very excited to learn more about. Until then, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.